Activision.
Activision was having a rough time in the late 80s. They were one of many companies that were still reeling from the 1983 US console industry crash. And it was especially felt at Activision because they were one of the major third-party developers for Atari and Intellivision consoles. Over the next few years, the company pivoted to computer game publishing and went through a bankruptcy and a major restructuring. There was a brief period when they had completely renamed the company to Mediagenic. For some reason, it's complicated, don't worry about it. While they were in the middle of all this, the game industry was also at a turning point. The next generation of computer and console hardware was right on the horizon. The Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo were about to launch in the United States, and multimedia CD-ROM technology wasn't far behind. So, if you were a company like Activision that was rebuilding from the ground up, what was your strategy going to be? Enter William Volk, the Vice President of Technology at Activision from 1988 to 1994. Among his many responsibilities, Volk's job was to figure out everything at Activision related to platforms and engines. Out of the 150 employees at Activision, he was one of only 8 who survived the layoffs when Bobby Kotick bought the company in 1991. So he had a lot of responsibility on his shoulders. He even ended up producing a couple games that they identified as being key titles, notably Return to Zork in 1993, and the CD-ROM release of Cyan's interactive storybook, The Manhole, one of the earliest games ever released on CD. Volk recently donated his hard drive backups to the Video Game History Foundation, and his correspondence, memos, and documentation paint a rich record of how a major game company navigated a new era of interactive media. Once we figured out how to recover the data from his backup tape and read the files on it, we put his papers in our digital library for anyone to do research with. Here are 6 interesting things we found in the William Volk papers. One thing we noticed is that while Activision was recovering from their bankruptcy, they were pretty conservative with what games they published and what they were willing to take risks on. Volk had a document tracking games being submitted to Activision in 1992, and they passed on almost all of them. Whoever was evaluating these games was unsparing in their criticism, like this comment about Battle of Olympus for Game Boy, which they called very simple, uninteresting. Or even worse, their comment on Super Kickoff for Game Boy, which was, and I quote, worse than Battle of Olympus. But it comes through in other places too. In this development timeline for the game Radical Rex, which was originally called Baby T-Rex, it looks like the game's production hit a snag early on when the Activision sales team raised concerns about how well a game called Baby T-Rex was actually going to sell. They ended up meeting with developer Beam Software to get some reassurances about the title, and then shortly afterwards, they held a focus group and selected a new title. At this time, Activision was being very cautious about what projects they were willing to commit their resources to. A similar issue popped up with the Game Boy port of Death Track, developed by Argonaut Software but never actually published. Based on this spreadsheet, it looks like Activision made the call that they weren't comfortable releasing the game unless it had a license attached to it, to ensure that it was actually going to sell enough to justify the project. Activision tried seeking out the Mad Max license to put on the game, and when that didn't come through, the game was cancelled. Game history researchers already knew that Death Track was cancelled close to release, but this sheds new light on why it was cancelled. It was a precarious time still for Activision, and they weren't going with anything that didn't have strong sales and marketing potential right out of the gate. As the head of technology at Activision, Volk often went out to conferences to learn about new products and tech that were in development. He wrote up his thoughts from these events and shared them with the rest of the company, and he also got a couple similar reports from other Activision staff. These reports from events like the Consumer Electronics Show reported on things like early impressions for the then upcoming 3DO console. Volk noted that programmers were excited about it, but producers were more cautious given some of the bottlenecks on the system's hardware and video compression. You can also find write-ups about games that were being shown off, some of which never came out, like this brief summary of a little-seen cancelled title called Screaming Metal by the creators of the hit Macintosh game Spaceship Warlock. I think this report is the most information we've ever heard about this game. We also like this report from the 1993 Computer Game Developers Conference by Activision producer Tom Sloper. He doesn't just summarize the panels he went to, but he also wrote about the meetings he took with developers, the lunches he had with executives, and the topics of conversation around the industry. There was a lot of talk in 1993 about the new immersive BattleTech mech simulators that were popping up in the US. Evidently, Maxis co-founder Jeff Braun was interested, but according to a talk from designer Ro Adams, they weren't actually doing well compared to similar arcade installations in Japan. Like we mentioned, a big part of Volk's job was evaluating new technology. He would go to those trade shows like CES, but he would also meet with the developers of upcoming hardware and report back about what they were working on. Volk got early glimpses of a whole lot of different technology. In his papers, you can read memos with early impressions of systems like the Sega Genesis, which in this report is just being referred to as Mega, or the Super Famicom, which Volk evidently liked more than the Genesis, at least from a development standpoint, or the PlayStation, which was being abbreviated internally as PSX. We also have some evidence that shows that Activision was talking with Nintendo about their CD-ROM add-on for the Super Nintendo that was in development. And not the Nintendo PlayStation, not that one. Based on the date on this, we think he would have been talking about the one that was in development with Philips. Apparently, Volk had some detailed technical questions about how its CPU and RAM worked. There's also a few platforms Volk evaluated that never ended up going anywhere. He had a letter to Sony about the Data Discman electronic book format, which maybe it's not surprising that it was never used for video games, but Volk's job was to figure that out. Okay, time for a quick aside. William Volk's backups had around 3,000 files, and in the interest of time, we did not catalog them. They're all in our digital library, but if you search inside the Volk papers, you're not going to find anything at first. By default, our digital archive only shows the items we've actually cataloged, which we did on purpose so that you don't get thousands of loose files without dates or descriptions whenever you search. To search inside the Volk papers, all you need to do is click the Show Uncatalogued Files button, and voila, you can now search inside these files the same way you can do for magazines or other items. If you need more information about a particular file, check out the manifest included with each hard drive backup, which contains a list of every single file and the date it was created. Okay, back to the actual video now. Activision had many titles in production in the early 90s, and quite a few of them never came out. From the production schedules and documents that Volk kept on his hard drive, we can learn a lot about what some of these games were and what happened to them. For instance, there's snippets in the Volk papers about games like Parallel Worlds, which was a choose-your-own-adventure game designed by Steve Englehart. This project seems to have gotten far enough along that it was being designed on paper, including a game map and 2 draft scripts from August 1990 containing the story outline and dialogue. You could probably remake the first half of this game based on these documents. We also now have slightly more information about the unreleased third game in the Planetfall series, which entered production in 1993. We now know that it was going to use the same engine as Return to Zork, and according to his contract, Planetfall's author Steve Moretsky was due to come back as the game's designer and basically be their in-house story master. The game was due out in September 1994 and was originally planned for all major CD-based systems, including, believe it or not, the Nintendo CD, making this one of the only games we can actually confirm was being planned for the system. There's a few other curiosities in here, like an unannounced game called Dracula vs. Frankenstein for Super Nintendo, which seems to have been cancelled extremely quickly after Activision realized that Universal's monster movies weren't in the public domain. But the one that might be most interesting to our viewers is some new information about a cancelled series of franchise reboots planned for the Super Nintendo. Activision had planned to relaunch some of their old Atari franchises, with new versions of River Raid, Kaboom, and Pitfall. Now, although Pitfall: The Mayan Adventure did come out, we never heard much about the other 2 ones, River Raid: Mission of No Return, and Kaboom: The Mad Doctor's Revenge, apart from some limited coverage of these games in Electronic Gaming Monthly. From the Volk papers, we now know that River Raid was being developed by Beam Software, and Kaboom was being made by Sculptured Software, two studios that did a lot of this type of development outsourcing. Both games were cancelled internally in June 1993, just weeks after they were demoed at the Summer Consumer Electronics Show. Seeing how only one magazine even bothered covering both games, we're guessing the tepid public response at CES played a role in these two games getting cancelled. Activision wasn't the only company dealing with a big change in platforms and technology. Over at Sierra Online, the creators of adventure game franchises like King's Quest and Leisure Suit Larry, they were also having concerns about which platforms they should be developing for. By 1989, the Apple II computer, which was previously one of the big platforms for Sierra, was on its way out, and Apple's new platforms, the Apple IIgs and the Macintosh, hadn't proven themselves as gaming platforms on the same level as the Apple II yet. So in October 1989, Ken Williams, the president and CEO of Sierra, wrote this hostile letter to Apple CEO John Sculley in which he threatened to pull support for Apple hardware unless Apple subsidized their development costs and committed their own marketing resources to promote Sierra games. Of course, this didn't happen, and Sierra abandoned Apple II and IIgs support by the end of the year. So why did William Volk have a copy of this letter? Our best guess is that computer game publishers talked with each other about their relationships with platform owners, like mean girls at a lunch table. So even though they were competitors, Activision was clued in about the challenges Sierra was facing. And one last one that's much funnier today than it was 30 years ago. As we mentioned, Volk was the technical director for Return to Zork, a CD-ROM sequel to Infocom's famous interactive fiction series from the 70s and 80s. There is a lot in the William Volk papers about the development of Return to Zork and its engine, so if you're interested in that, it's worth digging in. Volk was also keeping an eye on other games like Return to Zork that were coming out. In 1993, Virgin Interactive released The Seventh Guest, a landmark FMV puzzle game, so naturally he was paying close attention to that. Later that year, Volk went to the CompuServe message forums and saved every post he could find where someone expressed an opinion about The Seventh Guest. That way, the team at Activision could see what people did and didn't like about it. It's all very informational, but there's one review in there that caught our eye. This poster on CompuServe said that the graphics and sound are the best I've ever seen on a PC, but it's a shame the puzzles are so dull. That reviewer was Jeff Keighley. Jeff would have been around 14 years old when he wrote this post. This is potentially the first video game review he ever wrote. We actually reached out to Jeff and he confirmed this was his post because he recognized his CompuServe user number. That's some of the interesting material we found in the William Volk papers. Who knows what else you'll catch in there? I know a lot of folks know the Video Game History Foundation because of video game magazines and other eye-catching materials, but this is the kind of collection I love making available for researchers. This is the kind of stuff that gets cited in books and videos, and hey, maybe even yours. As a reminder, this is all available for free because of supporters like you. Help us keep working on projects like this by making a donation to our nonprofit or joining our Patreon at gamehistory.org/donate. See you next time!